I'm going to share some personal stories today that deal with miscarriage and pregnancy loss. And so I just want to do a content warning. If this is something that is recent or raw for you, then you might want to just press pause and check in with yourself and see whether now is the time to listen or watch this, or whether you want to leave it for the moment. You may have heard me talking about the idea of what I have named the two camps trap. When we think of our businesses and when we think of a business model, for me, I think of the business model canvas because that's the tool that I've used for a very long time to conceptualize all of the different parts of a business. But when we think about a business, what the two camps trap speaks into is the fact that for most people, we have an external camp approach to business, which is where we see the role or the purpose of business to be about the profit maximization, or the focus purely being on the aspects of, okay, what's the product or service that it is I'm selling? How do I sell that more? How do I grow, scale? We have a very narrow, one-dimensional view of what the business's role is. And in the external camp, we sit all ideas to do with contribution or purpose or giving back. Any of those ideas we see as being external to our business. They may be enabled by the business. So if we have a really good month, a really good quarter, we might be able to be more generous. But the actual sense of meaning, the way that we contribute, doesn't seep into the way we think about the core business activities, the operations, the decisions we're making, and how we run the business. So that's the external camp. The internal camp, which is where I have worked for so long to help business leaders shift their own mindset and start to be able to bring some of these concepts of meaning and contribution back inside the way that they think about and operate their business. The internal camp is the place where, when you do it well, when you genuinely integrate the aspects of what I call a both and mindset, what it allows you to do is to merge money and meaning. And when you do that, you can be unapologetic about the fact that you are absolutely wanting to grow or scale your business, that you are wanting to make more money, that you want the business to be sustainable and profitable. All of that is something that you can actually sit well with and be proud of, because you are thinking about it and running the business in a way that is taking responsibility for and thinking about the aspects of how it is you made that money in the first place, not just what you do with it once you make it. Now, for some of you, you might look at the graphic that I've created around the two camps trap, and you might think, yeah, okay, wow, I get it. And I have been thinking in the external camp, and I want to shift over to thinking about my business differently in that internal camp. For others, I know that it can still be a little bit confusing. It can take time for this to settle in your mind and to really understand what I mean and what this looks like in practice to actually think about and run your business with an internal camp approach rather than an external camp. And so what I want to start doing for you in this, within the platform and opportunity to have a bit of a conversation back and forward around questions that you're asking me, is I want to start to give you some examples of different businesses and what this can look like in different business models or different industries to start to run your business like this. Today, I want to share two different, very personal stories with you that I'm going to use to illustrate one example of how something plays out if you have the external camp type approach to your business, and one story that speaks to the experience when there is an internal camp approach. And hopefully through listening to these and seeing the practicalities through an actual experience of mine, it will help to start to make some of this fall into place in your own mind and not just to be some theoretical idea that I'm talking to you about. I've had the unfortunate experience of losing multiple babies, and each of those was very different, and obviously they were all horrible. But one of the pieces that is interesting as I reflect on how the choices that different businesses, different organizations, different people chose to make in those individual experiences that I had, what is fascinating is that the most traumatic loss that I experienced actually had the most care, kindness, thoughtfulness layered around it that helped soften that experience for me. And all of those aspects happened because organizations chose to have an internal camp approach to the way they ran their businesses and their organizations, and to the way that they showed up as people in the world. And so I'm going to tell you a very personal story and weave into it the way that others held me up and supported me through that experience. So nearly 17 years ago, I went into labour prematurely, and we were out. We were anchored So we were sailing, and so we were anchored at night, and I went into labour and couldn't stop what was happening in my body. And so I went through a horrible birth and proceeded to hemorrhage. I gave birth to our son, Isaac, and in that moment and sort of how it played out and the trauma of it, I didn't realise the seriousness or the fact that I was actually in danger, because it was just such a all-consuming traumatic experience. But luckily we had Brad's parents were with us on the boat, and when I had bled through all the towels, all the linen, and was showing no sign of stopping my bleeding, Brad's mum encouraged him to radio in for help. And from that moment on, a whole bunch of different people's decisions affected my experience of a very traumatic loss. So we had multiple people. I don't remember how many. There was at least 6 people who came out on a speedboat to get me. And so we left our other 2 kids with Brad's parents on the boat, and Brad came with me in the speedboat. And they took me back in to the closest place. They obviously were looking after me while we were travelling back in. And then they had called in a retired doctor who happened to live there. And he came down. He met us there. They gave me different injections and things to try to contract and stop my bleeding. And as we were coming back in, a helicopter had been called in. So I had a medical evacuation back over to the mainland, and to a hospital, obviously. Sorry. As I came in to the hospital, again, beautiful. Everyone was very lovely. I had one confusing interaction in the emergency as I came through, but one of my sisters got on the phone and sorted that out. But other than that, I was very well looked after. Great people. And anyone who has spent any time in a hospital as a patient or a visitor or worked in a hospital knows that they are incredibly intense environments. They have a lot of pressure. Most of the time, they don't have enough budget, they don't have enough staff, everyone is under the pump. But what proceeded for me after this whirlwind of being brought in, I then had to go in I had to be operated on and have my placenta removed and different things, and stop the bleeding. But when I came out, I had beautiful midwives who brought me my son and let me spend that night with him, and I got to hold him and sing to him. And then what was fascinating was the way they beautifully had in place a system to take away a whole bunch of the mental load and decisions and added stress that normally comes if you go through this experience and lose a baby. So one of the first things that happened was that I was given this quilt, this baby quilt. So there was a group of quilters. It's got their details here. Group of local quilters who make these baby quilts to be given to mothers who lose their babies. And so the first thing that was removed from my experience was that even though I didn't leave with my baby, I didn't leave empty-handed. And this quilt, I slept with this quilt for months after I lost Isaac. When I say slept, I didn't really sleep for months. But I would go to bed at night with this because I couldn't have him. So this was one aspect of thought that was woven in to how my experience was softened. The next aspect was that without me having to make any decisions or do anything intense, I was told that there was a local funeral home which would take care of everything for me. So they would come and collect Isaac, and he would be cremated, and then the ashes would be posted to me back at my home. So I was obviously given that option. I wasn't told I had to do that, but I agreed. And then I didn't have to think about that again. I didn't have to do anything complicated. I wasn't then given a bill to pay. And not long after I got home, in the mail, I received these, the ashes of my son. And it was done with respect and beautifully. And I was treated as if I was a valued paying customer, even though I wasn't. But something in that business acknowledged that even though that's how they made their money, was charging people for funeral services and for cremations and all of those aspects. That was their core business. It's how they made money. But like me, I'm guessing that they also felt that losing a child is horrendous and I would say not natural. I think we all understand that death is inevitable and that we are going to lose people. And you can get your head around that at some aspects of life and losing people. But from personal experience, I can say that it's pretty impossible to get your head around it when it's a child. For whatever reason, this company offered this beautiful, life-changing service without charging for it. And it softened my experience in a way that I can't even properly articulate. The next thing that happened for me was that I got in the mail from the hospital a little parcel that had photos that the midwife had taken of Isaac, and then this little book that they had put together with his measurements, his name, all of the aspects, Yeah, I already said measurements. Little feet prints and hand prints that they took, his little wristband, and the photos. And they had even gone to the trouble of, filling in the card with our names and his name. They had written where and when he was born and the name of the boat that he was born on, and that Brad and I were there, and Isaac's siblings Isabel and Zeke were there, and his grandparents Terry and Bon. So they put together for me a token that honoured Isaac, validated him and his birth, and gave me something to keep that I would otherwise not have had. And so what I found really interesting as I sat with this the other night when I got home, and I went through my, I have a special box with all of Isaac's stuff in it. And when I went through that experience and the decisions that were made by different organisations and different people, there was this beautiful tapestry of different people using what I would call a mix of their time, talent, and treasure, all in ways that saw the role of and the impact and contribution of organisations and businesses as being so much more than just, do they make more revenue than they spend in costs? Are they maximising profits? These people's behaviour showed that they realised how interconnected we all are, that they were tuned into what they valued and cared about, and they were living that out through the use of the different assets they had at their disposal. So if we go back through the different pieces I spoke about, this quilt that these quilters made for me, if we think of the time, talent, and treasure piece, they were using their time to sit and volunteer and make these quilts. They were absolutely using their talent to use the skills they had to make this. And the aspect related to treasure in that sense is more around the philanthropic and the giving, right? So they gave of their resources in a way that wanted to soften the experience for women who were going through the loss of a baby. So there's that aspect. When we think about the funeral home that picked up Isaac, that cremated Isaac, and that sent me his ashes, they were running that business in a way that had, for whatever reason, decided that this was an area where they wanted to contribute and make a difference, and that they could use their business in this way to actually really take to the next level all of those things they had at their disposal, their time, their talent, and their treasure. They sent someone to the hospital to pick up my son. They used their facility, their infrastructure and resources to cremate my son. Their staff used their time, and their company used their resources to treat his ashes with the same respect they did when someone paid them. And they then, posted those to me with no expectation of anything in return. From the aspect of this external camp, internal camp, the way we think about our business, I want to stay for a moment on this funeral home. By adding this dimension in, now they absolutely can, and I hope do, treat all their paying customers with the same level of respect. I'm pretty sure they would, because I don't think you would do this for someone that wasn't paying if you weren't that kind of person anyway. But if we think about the fact that their team and staff were dealing with grief and suffering and loss every day, helping families, loved ones go through the grieving process and giving them a way to honour and farewell their loved one in a beautiful way. By adding in this aspect to the way they ran their business, there was that extra level of connectedness and feeling human and part of something bigger than just an attempt to make more money. There was a way to connect in with a local community and say, we want that experience of going into the hospital and being able to honour and respect these beautiful babies and these families who are suffering. And their staff were therefore able to experience that sense of purpose and contribution themselves, their own role and part in that. They were able to experience the pride in working for an organisation that behaved with such beautiful integrity and humanness. And it consolidates a number of really important aspects that strengthen and actually genuinely bring competitive advantage to a business. But they do it all within the confines of how they run that business, all through the core business activities, the decisions they make, how they spend their money, and how they treat people. What they didn't do in that example was say, if we have a good year this year, then we'll make a donation to a local charity to help a particular cause. They brought it in-house and they took responsibility for what they had control and influence over and how they chose to show up. Now you'll notice that they didn't, and I wouldn't encourage them to make all their services free. They are absolutely running a business. Part of why I made those connections for you around the fact that staff having an increased sense of purpose and pride in working for an organisation like this, and the essence of building the brand and reputation of who you are and what you stand for in a community. I brought those things up because they not only have meaning and bring purpose to us as individuals, whether you work for the company or own the company, or like me, you experience it from the outside. But I brought those up because they also have financial flow-on impacts. The way that I talk about this when I am working with a business and working on a business model is to frame them as those competitive advantages. I've mapped out the 9 competitive advantages that you can get when you start to merge money and meaning, when you think about your business from this internal camp perspective. So as a business, they weren't trying to undermine the business. They weren't being apologetic for the fact that they charge for their services, but they were being more holistic. They were looking in a broader sense at how they could bring that aspect of money and meaning back together. And in doing so, what occurs is this beautiful mutual win-win of strengthening the financial stability of a business as it grows and has the benefits of those types of behaviours and decisions, but also having this beautiful flow-on effect of positive impact in the world through the meaning that you have brought into the business. Whether that relates to those pieces I spoke about of the staff having a sense of meaning and purpose and pride of who they work for, whether it's for the owners of the business or those running the business, being proud of what it is they've built and how they show up every day, or whether it's for individual customers or people that have benefited from something like I did, where in my instance I didn't actually even pay for it. That aspect of meaning makes this go to a whole nother level as an organisation than if you were purely in a scarcity mindset that was desperately seeking to claw every cent you could out of every person you interacted with. So that's the piece I want to dig into around the business itself. The next piece I want to dig into in the example that I've given is around the hospital. So with the package that they sent me with the photos and the footprints and handprints and the little wrist name tag piece and all of the things that were in this. A little bit like the funeral home, there's multiple aspects that we could pull apart from this story as an example of having an internal camp mindset. I mentioned to you in telling the story that, hospitals are intense, crazy places. They are stressful, fast-paced, and always experiencing, yes, joyful moments of healthy births, but also horrible tragedies and deaths on all different levels and sickness and suffering. And so very often that can be an exhausting, toxic and stressful environment. Yet this story that I told you and my experience in losing Isaac was that within that busyness, within the same structures where nursing staff are stretched, people are tired and under pressure, and there's not much budget. By having this more human approach and by seeing how connected we all are and asking that question of who can play what role. No one organisation has to try to be everything. If you pull apart my story, you'll see that there was the quilting group, there was the funeral home, there was the hospital staff themselves. And then the other piece to point out is that when I turned the booklet over, the booklet itself was provided by a non-profit, a charity that specifically focuses on infant loss. And so what you can see in this story is that each organisation, some of them, yes, were charities and non-profits, some of them were volunteers in terms of the quilters. But when it comes to the hospital itself and when it comes to the funeral home, both of these are run as organisations that absolutely have to make money. And the humanness and the thinking through the consequences of our decisions and how we treat people were handled in such a way that what was one of the most, or of any single event, it was the most traumatic, horrendous experience of my life. And they softened that for me and allowed me to be able to move through that with less trauma and grief than I would have otherwise experienced. And so what it means is I can sit with these beautiful memories and acknowledgements of Isaac in a way that I would not have been able to if they didn't operate within an internal camp. I don't know what it looks like for your business, but I hope that there's something in that example and in that story across, whether it's the hospital or whether it's the funeral home, where you start to think through the aspects of how you could shift your business model, how you could start to not just see contribution and meaning as sitting outside your business model or about being the donation of profit, but seeing them through that lens of how do I make decisions? What do I have decision-making rights over? Where do I have influence? Where am I spending money? What skills or infrastructure do we have that we could leverage in different ways? And what do I care about? What is something that I want to be aligned with and contributing to? So that's the first story and experience, and how that played out for me when there was an internal camp approach. The second story that I'm going to tell you is actually the one that I'm going to connect to what it looks like if you operate your business with an external camp approach, where you just ignore how you're making decisions and running the business, and you push the ideas of contribution or meaning to sit outside your organization. It was actually this experience and remembering it that prompted me to make this video, and that drew my attention to the fact that these two very different experiences I had connected as great examples of the internal and external camps in the way we think about organizations and the role of business. So the other night I was driving home I was picking up my son from hockey, and as I drove I suddenly realized where I was, and I was like, oh, because I had just driven past the funeral home, the funeral home where I had to go to pick up the ashes of one of my sons. And so as I drove home, I kind of just sat with the memory of that and how horrible it was. And I started to think through that experience, and I was like, wow, that experience when I lost my son Oliver was really different to the experience after I lost Isaac. And I started to sort of pull apart some of the differences, and this is when I made the connection of, oh, this is a good example of internal and external camp. So I'll give you an overview of what happened when I lost Oliver and afterwards, and then just talk you through the aspects of how that was so different to the story I just told you about when I lost Isaac. So with Oliver, that was nearly 16 years ago now, because it was 1 year and 1 week after I lost Isaac, I then lost Oliver. And unlike my experience in the first hospital, I had been in labour, I think, for about 8 hours, and it was obvious that I couldn't stop it. Again, I had gone into labour early and there was no way Oliver was going to survive. So when I rang the hospital and I talked to the midwives, and they said, yeah, you're going to need to come up to the hospital. We drove up to the hospital and entered into the scene that I described to you before, like this chaotic. We had to go through the emergency kind of process. And they were busy and stressed, didn't really care. Before I had even been paid much attention to or been triaged properly, I could tell I needed to, I was about to give birth. So I ended up giving birth to Oliver on the toilet in the bathroom. And horrible experience. What's interesting is, unlike the story with Isaac, where I could tell you about the quilt and the midwives and the different aspects of that, I don't have any memories like that with Oliver. There wasn't the pleasant aspects of being cared for. Instead, I had loads of paperwork I had to fill in, and I was told I had to make some decisions about his cremation and different pieces, which I did have to not only fill in loads of paperwork for, but I had to pay for, and it was adding decisions and practicality and stress and added pieces to a person who was already experiencing physical trauma as well as the loss of a baby. And those aspects of staff under pressure who just didn't have the capacity to care for me or to give me the dignity of having my son not in a bathroom, and who the constraints that they worked within in that hospital meant that they couldn't even take the time to fill in the paperwork for me or to create these beautiful memories like the other hospital did. They didn't have that scope or autonomy or systems in place to help me or care for me or take that burden off me. They didn't have a partnership with a funeral home that made that process more streamlined and less devastating. So there were elements that were outside of the staff's control because there was no systems in place, because they were under such pressure and stress and budgetary constraints. And rather than any partnership with a funeral home, they just had providers who you then just had to pay for and fill in paperwork, and it was all very transactional. I don't think I need to, I was about to say labour the point. That would be a not very nice pun. I don't think I need to, stay on that point too long for it to be really apparent how different those experiences are. The pieces that I want to really focus on for you in terms of how that second experience, this story I just told you of when I lost Oliver, and the fact that nothing buffered me from the trauma, nothing held me or cared for me or had thought ahead and connected dots and brought more humanness to that experience. Instead, it was just pump everything through that system. How do we operationalize and automate and have, efficient processes, because this is stressful and the pressure's on and the budgets are tight. So the fact that I had to do all of those pieces, and then when my son was cremated, I had to drive and pick him up. All of those pieces were completely different to my experience when I lost Isaac. And yet my loss of Isaac physically was far more traumatic and incredibly dangerous. And it just fascinates me when we as business leaders act as if our businesses operate in some kind of vacuum, in isolation, and that the choices we are making are not having a broader impact. Can you see through these two stories I've told you how the decisions that leaders made, and let's just focus it down, the decisions leaders made at both those hospitals and at both those funeral homes created a fundamentally different experience and flow-on impact in the world simply by having an external camp approach or an internal camp approach. Because you know what? That external camp approach of the hospital, whose team are under great pressure, who have nothing set up in place to properly connect in to supports or think ahead and soften people's experience when going through traumatic things, who are just focusing on the numbers game and the stress and pressure of pumping people through a system. That same hospital does massive fundraisers to raise money for different kids' charities and different pieces. So think back to that two camps trap graphic that I created. They see their organisation and they make these token attempts to contribute or bring meaning and raise money for a cause, and yet they are running that institution, running that organisation in a way that sends nurses, doctors, staff home massively stressed, under pressure, under-resourced, and pushed to the extreme without support. That forces those people on the customer side interacting with the hospital to be dehumanized in the process, not cared for, not looked after, and not respected. Those decisions to act as if the way we operate the business doesn't matter, because it's a business, so as long as it's making money, we're good. And then to push outside and do public fundraisers and do the contribution piece and profile that. How does that stack up, folks? Like, really? If you stop compartmentalizing and if you actually be honest with yourself and connect the dots and say, it's all interconnected here. Is it okay to run a business in that external camp approach? I would absolutely say no, it's not okay. And a big aspect of why I'm telling you this story and why I'm wanting to try to flesh out for you what it actually looks like, and that it does matter how we make these decisions. I'm doing that not because I'm saying everyone needs to start a charity or everything should be free. if that's the message you've got, you've missed the point. I'm telling you this story and giving these two intense examples to try to hammer home for you that the reality is when we operate in the internal camp, so the first story I told you, my experience of losing Isaac, if we look at that hospital and that funeral home, if you ran your business, ran your organization like those two, what I'm saying is you will absolutely run a better business. You will have really significant competitive advantages, financial savings, reductions in turnover of staff and training, increased sense of purpose and contribution for the staff, for the owners, for the leaders. All of these pieces that allow you to unapologetically strengthen the money side, so the financial stability of the business. But you will be doing that because the mindset you have, the way you think about the purpose and role of your business is far more human, is far more holistic, and is saying, I'm taking an internal camp approach. I am taking responsibility for, sorry, my dog's going crazy. I'm taking responsibility for my decisions, for the way I behave, for the way I treat my staff, for the way I treat my customers. I am really sitting with all of the resources I have at my disposal and thinking about who are we as an organization? What do we care about? How do we want to be received and thought about in the community? All of those questions mean that not only is there the good financial side, it's actually come about because you brought meaning into the picture. It's actually come about and is strengthened by merging money and meaning. When you run a business in the way I'm suggesting and in the way I teach people to run a business, you design a business model that isn't token in its doing good or contribution to the world, that isn't about making up for some of the bad stuff you did inside the business by giving a donation and doing a nice little PR cleanup job. It is about genuinely creating the business model where these two parts that have previously been treated as if they are mutually exclusive, people for decades have acted as if it's a truth and it's a given that you cannot mix doing good and making money, that you cannot merge money and meaning. We act as if business and charity are these two distinct things when they are not. It is about being fully human and honest about the fact that everything is connected. And when you shift to that mindset, to the both and mindset that acknowledges two things that seem contradictory can be equally true. When you do that, you run a better business because these two things become mutually reinforcing. They're mutually reinforcing. When you merge money and meaning, you're not picking one over the other. You're genuinely strengthening the financial stability of your business, but doing it in a way you can be proud of. And so I do hope that in hearing these very personal stories of mine and in making those connections in your own mind of how these different decisions in the hospitals and in the funeral homes, how they had flow-on effects. What I would love for you to do is to sit with those examples and reflect on your own business and the areas where you might be operating with an external camp approach. And reflect on how could you show up differently? How could you start to run your business differently so you genuinely merged money and meaning integrated that into the business model itself and allowed your business to be strengthened and to grow from a place that was deeply human, from a place that is honourable, from a place that you can actually be proud of. Because how we make money matters, not just what we do with it after we make it.